facilitate, the big word, facilitated administration that everybody chokes on. But policies, procedures, caseloads should be rethought based on what the key elements and activities of the model are, based on what does it take to engage the target population, how much time, is it community-based, do we have to be out in the community during evening hours so that we can engage male caregivers, what exactly is required to do this model? Do my policies and procedures in my agency support that model? If not, I have to change that if I'm the administrator. And you'll get a chance to see what they did down here in Houston. Systems level interventions, often understood. This has to do with administrator to administrator. This is not, gee, we're having a problem working with Child Protective Services on these cases. Ms. Wraparound Facilitator, why don't you see if you can work something out with the protective service workers and see if we can get a good relationship going with them, and let's see if we can work better together. That's often the way things sorted out. Now, this should be done administratively. And there will be an example from the students' evaluations of their field sites where the Kansas City Protective Services actually did that. Really nice example. They can also be applied then in large organizations like hospitals. We've got a nursing department, social work department, the doctors, never the twain shall meet. Well, the administrators can talk with each other and try and work out how to better integrate those services if that's part of the model, the practice model. Ellison just passed through this, and this is something that's really developing in implementation science. A lot of this comes out of Heifetz and Lurie, I believe Harvard-based business folks. Technical leadership is often what we see, and adaptive leadership is usually what we need. When the answer is pretty clear, I should say when the problems are fairly well understood, commonly understood, and the solution is pretty obvious and everybody agrees on that solution, somebody who's good at doing whatever that solution is can take the leadership and take over and get that done. That's technical leadership. Most of what we face out in the real world requires adaptive leadership, complex situations, problems that are not commonly understood, requires building consensus amongst involved parties and agreeing upon the nature of the problem and coming up with some possible solutions. Adaptive leadership is mostly what we need when we're developing programs. Any questions on that? That's just the primer, and now I'll show you how our students applied it and how we applied it out here in Kansas City. I'm sorry, in Houston. Second time through, you got it all down by now, of course. In the program evaluation course, which is required at UMKC School of Social Work, we teach the NRN frameworks. We see it as a means of teaching students about program development as well as about program evaluation. And they also learn about the importance of using data in developing and evaluating programs. Not just a one-shot, how do you evaluate a program, but a combined, how do you develop and evaluate simultaneously a program. So they read all of the initial NIRM monograph, some of the more recent publications. We have different articles. They give examples of how the frameworks were used to evaluate 20 years of research on wraparound to identify gaps in the knowledge base of how to implement wraparound. So we give them an idea of how the frameworks can be used in multiple ways. And then once we ensure they understand the concepts, the constructs, they have to come up with a design, a method, review the literature based on what the practice model seems to be in their agency when they're placed, and then engage in an evaluation. First they evaluate the intervention components, and then they get coached around what they found, the data. If they don't quite have it right, if they need to get more data, they go out, they get more data, until they can say, this is what various levels in my field site, administrators, supervisors, direct service staff. This is what they think the practice model is. And then based on that, the second paper they do is they go out and they evaluate the competency drivers and the organization drivers. We don't ask them to take a look at adaptive versus technical because it's too situational. But we want them to learn the relationship between competency drivers and organization drivers, and how it has to be absolutely integrated with clarity of program model. So we had 40 students. They were great students 2 years ago. Had placed at 34 field sites. They used multi-method designs. They would look at training manuals if there were. They would look at any policies, procedures. They had semi-structured interviews, stratified samples of staff, and then they would compare and contrast and look for patterns of clarity or lack of clarity regarding implementation. Here's some common patterns that we found across all 34 sites at the end of that semester. In terms of the model definition, boy, were people confused. They got different answers from direct service providers, then they got from supervisors, then they got from administrators. That was tended to be the rule. There were exceptions. When they tried to dig deeper and say, well, what are the elements and the activities? What is it that you do? How does this improve child and family situations, if that's the target population? What they tended to hear was, we're eclectic. If we think, cognitive behavioral intervention technique would work, and if I've been to a training on cognitive behavioral therapy, I'll try that out and see if it works. But then if they get really stuck and they're kind of resisting, well, then we'll throw in some motivational interview. And so on and so on. They were making it up as they went along, but nobody was keeping track of it. They were just allowed to do this. When we asked about theory bases, the students asked, and most of the respondents couldn't say what the theory base was to what they were doing. The ones that were MSW trained would open up their overview text on human behavior in the social environment and pull out, oh, I think it's this. We're doing person and environment. Okay, fine. But then what they would say, or it's ecological systems theory. And then the student would say, well, tell me more. What do you do? How's that manifest in these activities and elements that you told me about? Oh, well, I'm looking at the person and the environment. I'm approaching them from a strengths perspective. But when I see resistance, then I'm thinking in terms of transference and projection. I'm sorry, those are incompatible theory bases. That should not be happening. And to the extent that that's out there and happening, we're not going to be getting good outcomes. The exceptions to this were agencies that had actually embraced a specific model. DBT, a positive behavioral support program in some of the schools, and the statewide project for changing communities regarding serving the homeless population. They actually could say exactly what they were doing, why they were doing it, etc. Another pattern found around target population. Commonly, data was not collected at the agencies about who they were serving unless it was required by the funding source. When they collected such data, it was totally in aggregate format. So there could be no differentiation of, well, Roselyn works better with African American clients, it seems. She's getting better outcomes with her African American clients than she is with her Caucasian clients. Maybe we should be focusing on this in the coaching sessions. They didn't have that kind of data. It was simply aggregate in response to what a funding source asked. Theory of change was like talking to somebody from Mars. Students would try and phrase that in every way possible, down to something as simple as, how do you what do you think you do that makes change happen? You said you did this. How does that make change happen? People just stumble over theory of change. It was like a foreign language to them. But again, since they weren't collecting outcomes, for the most part, it was kind of irrelevant. There was nothing to hold their feet to the fire. It was kind of like the white noise. Do your clients improve with white noise? Oh yeah, how do you know? Oh, I can tell. Again, the exceptions here were those clearly defined models, the DBT, the positive behavioral supports, the community building effort for the homeless. Alternative models, most of the administrators didn't even conceptualize this. They simply followed the money. If there was money to serve a certain population, they wrote a grant because it kept the agency alive. So all the grand, important things that we talk about yesterday and today, it's kind of irrelevant, or was irrelevant to most of the Kansas City administrators. They were just following the money. So they hadn't really considered, well, maybe I should be using NST with the kids in the school that we're doing positive behavioral supports with. Maybe a combination of the two would make it better outcomes. Something home-based as well as school-based. Never even thought of it. So here's what the students found around the competency drivers, and then I'll show you the organization drivers. Because there were so few clearly defined practice models, staff were not selected based on model. Staff were selected bureaucratically. Our funding source says we need to have licensed personnel. Our funding source says we're supposed to hire social workers for this, psychologists for that. They did not have criteria in their hiring processes for looking for people with certain knowledge or skills. They might have passion to work with a population. But that's about as far as they got. That was pretty much the common pattern. I'm obviously boiling down 34 evaluations into just a few bullet points, but this was the trend. Professional degree or licensure was the reason for hiring someone. What about training? Well, it was a bureaucratic organizational model. It was tended to have poorly defined practice models. Eclecticism, how do you train around eclecticism? You can't. So the training they got was HIPAA, policies, procedures, your rights as a staff member, all important things, but nothing model pertinent. Some sites said, well, but we do support our staff to go get their CEUs. Great. Students followed up with a question. Do you keep track of where they're earning the CEUs, around what topics? No. So it has nothing to do, per se, with the client population served. No. If they're interested in something, we figure they'll find a way to work it into their practice. The exceptions were the psychiatric hospitals and medical services that specifically train around target population. However, particularly in the psychiatric hospitals, there was a use of group treatment models during the day, various types, activity, some therapeutic, etc. No treatment groups. In fact, what they found was that the staff were selecting topics for groups by Googling, I'm serious, by Googling inpatient group therapy. And then they would find something and they would come up with a topic for the day. Coaching, common patterns. It was ad hoc risk containment. Come to me with your hottest case. I'll be there if you need me. It was not regularly scheduled. It was any time left over, we talk about paperwork, administrative concerns, and any time left over after that, how are you hanging in there? This is a tough population to work with. Caseload's pretty tough. Well, none of that's going to produce competence around any practice model. They were not using data. They had no idea what the knowledge base was, what the skills were. They couldn't tell whether it was improving or not. It was entirely subjective, based on ad hoc risk containment supervision. So they relied upon training events. They would have someone come in and provide a training on something related to the population, for example. Performance assessment. As you might imagine, how can you measure fidelity if you don't have a clearly defined practice model? Most of the staff at every level in the stratified samples for the semi-structured interviews said, you mean annual employee evaluations? Yeah, we